This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. Continuing our series of interviewing the candidates for mayor of Chicago, except for Tiny Dancer.
Yeah, he still hasn't returned my call or email. He isn't right. I tried to drop off a note at his door. That didn't work out.
He's scared. That's all right. I
He's
understand.
Pick out his little miniature horse.
We've talked to Willie Wilson. We've talked to Lori Lightfoot. And this morning, we talked to Paul Vallas, former head of Chicago Public Schools, former candidate for governor, former candidate for lieutenant governor with Pat Quinn in 2014, now candidate for mayor of Chicago in 2019. Paul, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. How's my reception?
Very good.
Perfect.
Good.
So let me ask you this, because I think the answer is different depending on the candidate. So I'll put this to you. Is a Paul Vallas candidacy, is this about paradigm shift or is it about a personality contest?
I think it's about paradigm shift because I've always been more of a manager than a politician, and I think my candidate's about putting somebody in the mayor's office who knows how to manage multi-billion-dollar budgets with an eye towards long-term planning and the type of long-term planning that can transform those budgets into vehicles for investing in the communities and not just financial plans that provide for immediate political benefit while kicking the can down the road.
You mean
Go ahead.
You mean like borrowing $10 billion at
Right.
Sopranos rates to try and pay down $30 billion in unfunded pension liabilities?
Yes. A little bit of like that. Or like suddenly promising in an election year that there's going to be $2 billion to retrofit CPA stations, or suddenly after the schools have been in severe financial crises for the last 7 years, to suddenly have $1 billion to build new schools when the student population, at least since my departure, has declined by 70,000. Those are, I think they all fall into the same categories.
And so how are you going to bring up this sinking ship? What would you do differently?
Well, the first thing that you have to do is you really have to look at the budget as two things, as a long-term financial plan, so that you're just not budgeting from year to year. Because when they do that, they have a tendency to, in effect, put off for tomorrow or for the next generation what they need to address today. And I believe the second thing that you have to do is you have to really develop a budget that's an investment document. The city's shrinking. The city's lost 17% of its property value. Its population continues to decline. The school district's population is almost in free fall. And when a city is shrinking, the property tax base is contracting, which means the remaining property taxpayers pay higher property taxes. And the city's contracting because the city has not been focusing on public safety. They have not been focusing on basic infrastructure. They have adopted the type of tax and fee policies that are really extraordinarily punitive. I mean, look at the impact that the fees and fines are having on the poorest communities in the city of Chicago, where there were 10,000 bankruptcies, 80% of them in predominantly African-American wards, or where they're suspending tens of thousands of driver's licenses because people have been unable to pay these extraordinary, almost extortionist fees. So I think what you've got to do is you've got to design a budget that's both disciplined and a budget that sets spending priorities so that you are investing in the type of things that are going to help grow the city, that are going to help keep the population in the city and not drive people away.
I want to talk about CPS since you had time there, so you know the system. You just alluded to it. The abuse scandal that has been documented in the pages of the Chicago Tribune over the last several weeks, and really not, for me, quite surprisingly, not received a lot of public attention, really. And I wonder if something changed from the time you were there until to the present in terms of protocols and handling instances of misconduct, whether by staff or students towards other students, or is this something that has been endemic for a long time and it's just been investigated and now brought to light recently?
Well, there are always going to be predators, and I remember when I was in the Chicago Public Schools, our number of employees exceeded 40,000. Yeah, it's as large as the city. So at the end of the day, there are always going to be individuals who are going to who are going to do bad things, and the key is being able to not only identify them and spot them, but to have the capacity to respond when complaints are brought to your attention. I mean, I can't sit here and to say that in my 6 years there was no one in the school who tried to exploit children, but I can say that whenever we had an issue that was brought to our attention, we immediately investigated it and we immediately took actions. Our approach was to have a series of protocols in place that everybody was expected to follow in terms of reporting incidents, whether they were the incidents identified in the Tribune series, or for that matter, any sort of incident where a child or a faculty member was put in harm's way.
Well,
we also had a 20.
But I'm sorry, but in light of what the Tribune is reporting about laws that were clearly broken, reporting requirements that were not met,
Exactly.
mishandling of complaints that were brought to school authorities. As the mayor, I don't want to pretend like the mayor's not in charge of the school system like Rom likes to pretend. Of course he is, right? And so what do you think should be done in CPS now in response to what we know was going on?
Well, let me tell you what we did and what they appeared to have failed to do.
Okay.
First of all, we didn't have the law department investigate these type of cases. When there was a case brought to our attention, we turned it over to the police and we turned it over to the Department of Children and Family Services, and we had an office. We had a crisis intervention office that was almost joined at the hip with the Department of Children and Family Services. So the right entities immediately investigated the case. The second thing we did was whenever there was an individual who was a suspect, or whenever a complaint was made against an individual, we immediately pulled that person out of the classroom. Even if we didn't have the evidence to move to fire them, we removed them from the classroom. I remember there was a floor in the Chicago Public Schools called Camp Beverly, because Dr. Beverly managed that floor, and we had people who had been pulled out of the classroom who were being investigated because we wanted to err on the side. We wanted to err on the side of obviously safety. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing we did was 24-hour reporting and intervention. So, I mean, there was not an incident that impacted our children, or for that matter, not only in school, but anywhere in the community where we didn't get a report and we didn't provide crisis intervention. So if you had a child who was shot in the community, we would learn about it. We would dispatch our crisis intervention team. So those are things that, and then
and they don't have that anymore?
I'm sorry. No, they don't have that. And the final thing is we were completely transparent. Look, I was stunned that the mayor's spokesman made the comment that the mayor didn't know about the investigation, Tribune investigation, the findings of the investigation until like 2 weeks before the investigation went public, when they only filed something like 18 Freedom of Information requests.
Yeah, right.
So at the end of the day, there was nothing that would go on in the schools that would not be brought to my attention, because we had a centralized police command. We had we would call it the school police unit. And I would get reports on a daily basis if a student was a victim of violence or any improper act anywhere, even if it was in their own communities. And we had the crisis teams to respond to it. And those are all things that I would restore. And I think those are things that for some reason or another fell by the wayside the last 10, 15 years.
Just, people so they can get to know you better. Your wife, Sharon, is a police officer. Your two sons are police officers. I don't know if you saw the raw video released of the Augustus shooting, but what do you think the atmosphere is like for Chicago police officers out there on the streets?
I truly believe that what has happened to the police department has really been tragic, because we have not been investing in the police department, and the police department has not had the resources, the infrastructure, the training, nor the monitoring to be effective and to be held fully accountable. when you have 2,000 fewer officers than were at one time in the budget, when you allowed the detectives ranks to shrink from 1,200 to 700, and we didn't have a large number of detectives in the first place. Now they're rapidly trying to hire back. When you decimate your sergeant ranks, so you have one sergeant for every 30 officers as opposed to one for every 10, and now they're rapidly hiring the sergeants back. When you don't have comprehensive training and redundant training to train these officers and these young officers on how to deal with the mental health patients that have been released into the community because the mayor didn't want to spend $2.5 million to keep the mental health centers open, or when officers are not being trained in de-escalation, and when you wait 5 to 6 years before you put tasers in the hands of officers and train them on how to use the tasers, what you have is a police force that is struggling just to hold the line, and you will have problems with accountability. And as you well know, the police officers, the police department strategy has been it's called the Violent Reduction Initiative. And Dan, what they do is, and Amy, what they do is they just move police around all over the city. So you don't have beat integrity. You don't have those officers in the community who really know the community, or for that matter, the community who knows the officers. So at the end of the day, they create conditions for these tragic events to happen. So I've laid out a very detailed plan on how I would build the officers' ranks, restore the detectives division. I've called for the hiring back of retired detectives like they did in New York and like they've done in other cities, so that they can, when your murder rate clearance rate, when your clearance rate for solving murders is 17% and shootings for 5%, I mean, you're not going to get much cooperation from the community. So I've laid out a very, very detailed and specific plan on how to increase police strength, on how to rebuild the supervisory ranks, and on how to provide the redundant training that the police need to be effective. And I've laid out how that restoration would be paid for.
Okay, well, yes, let's talk about that aspect of it, because I understand it's a multivariate equation, and you've covered a lot of ground. But on the issue of augmenting the ranks, Ron promised 1,000 more officers, never happened. If you're saying we're 2,000 officers short of where we should be, then how do you pay for those new hires?
Well, let me point out that the mayor has in his budget, I think, 13,600 officers. So he's rapidly trying to fill those positions. Unfortunately, too many officers are leaving for obvious reasons. And so when I was budget director, we had close to 14,000 officers on the street and in the schools combined. And what I would do is I would build those ranks back, and if you built those ranks back, I'm calling for 14,200 officers. If you built those ranks back, I believe that you could, in effect, free up enough money by having enough officers, so you weren't paying $125, $150, $175 million, depending on the year, more in overtime. Because currently, I believe in the last 7 years, they have spent $500 million more in overtime than they budgeted for. When we had police strength at the peak levels, when I was city budget director before I became school superintendent, the most we ever spent in overtime was $38 million, and when you adjust for inflation, it's $58 million. So they're in effect paying anywhere from $100, $125, $130 million more in overtime a year, simply because they're canceling leaves and they're working police for 14 straight days, and they don't have enough officers. So we're paying time and a half, and it's not only costing us a fortune, it's also worrying out the officers. And a lot of these officers that are dispatched to other communities that they don't know, they'll tell you that they're sitting in cars. They refer to themselves as scarecrows. So it's not like we're increasing their effectiveness. So through overtime alone, we would be able to come close. We'd be able to come close to filling those vacancies. And then I'm going to give you to covering those costs. And I'm going to give you one more example. I've called for the placement of police officers, at least one police officer in every school. And what I would do is I would take the existing safety and security positions and vacancies, and I would upgrade those positions so that I was actually hiring Chicago police officers. And if you did that, it would cut the cost of the officers to the city in half, because the schools would be picking up the cost of a regular security position. The city would be paying the difference. But let me tell you what that would mean. That would not only mean that our schools would be safe and secure, and that you would have once again a restoration of the school police unit, so that who were familiar with the students, who could respond to complaints, who could provide the type of safeguards that haven't been provided. But when schools are out, you would have 600 additional police officers that you could dispatch to the parks. You could dispatch to the hotspots where students gather, et cetera. So you wouldn't have to pay. You wouldn't have to pay the enormous amount of money in overtime. So I believe that plan would be financially, very financially viable, and it would do great service in terms of improving neighborhood safety.
Speaking of the schools, again, just quickly, charter schools and the opportunity tax credit scholarships, opportunity scholarships that are coming online, positive innovations for the city? Have they been things that have improved the quality of education and choice for Chicago families?
Well, I've supported charter schools, but I've never supported charter schools at the expense of traditional schools. But you know what they did, Dan? They went out and they opened like 120 charter schools. You remember Renaissance 2010, where they went in and they closed the plan was to close close to 100 neighborhood schools, dispatch the kids to different communities. If you didn't think that didn't unsettle the communities or destabilize the communities, and then reopen the schools, many of those schools as charter schools. I didn't think that was a sound strategy by any stretch of the imagination. So at the end of the day, I'm all for expanded school choice, but you have to have accountability, and you can't create overcapacity, because many of the problems that they're experiencing today, besides the fact that with all the uncertainty over the schools, they're significantly losing student enrollment, is the fact that they've created a system that they've contributed to the overcapacity. The second thing is I support the opportunity tax credit, and I've always supported state legislative efforts to provide support for the children of all taxpayers, regardless of whether or not where they send their kids to schools. All right. And I'll tell you why. Not only because I believe it's right, but I always felt that the broader the education coalition, the more effective the education coalition will be at securing the funding that all schools need. And I remember when I ran the Chicago Public Schools, we had a very, very close relationship with the Archdiocese. The heyday for the communities was when both the public schools and the parochial schools were thriving, and the Archdiocese actually lobbied and supported increased funding. Edgar, at the time, you remember, Dan, was trying to raise taxes to provide more money for schools, and the Archdiocese came to our defense, and they were there advocating for a better funding formula and for more funding for schools. So Paul, I think there's strength in numbers.
Paul, I appreciate that and your comprehensive answers. He's Paul Vallas, former CEO of Chicago Public Schools, a candidate for mayor this February, mayor of the city of Chicago. Paul, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro